No one wanted the fat virgin bride, not one man in that mocking crowd. They laughed as she stood on the church steps, cheeks burning, heart breaking, until a mountain man strode from the shadows and growled, "She's mine now." The laughter died. The church bell froze mid-chime. Even the wind went still. But what began as a shocking claim turns into something far deeper, because this rugged stranger didn't come for pity. He came to keep a promise. High in the snow-choked mountains, their pretend marriage must outlast gossip, greed, and the cruel railroad men who'd take everything they own. And when the town's richest man cries kidnapping, the truth that binds them could tear them apart. What vow could drive a man to claim a woman the world scorned? And when the law, the land, and her own shame close in, will love be enough to save them both? Or will honor cost them everything? No one wanted the fat virgin bride until the mountain man declared, "She's mine now." Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the cottonwood leaves, painting patterns on the church lawn, where Addison Wade arranged her apple pies on the wooden trestle table. Her capable hands, strong from years of kneading bread and working the farm, smoothed the checkered cloth beneath each tin. The sweet scent of cinnamon and baked fruit mingled with the crisp autumn air. Behind her, whispers rustled like dry leaves. Addison's shoulders tensed, but she kept working, letting her dark hair fall forward to shield her face. She'd endured 27 years of such whispers in Wind River. They shouldn't sting anymore, but they did. "Mighty fine pies," Mrs. Peterson said kindly as she passed, though her eyes held pity. Addison managed a small smile, grateful for the elderly woman's attempt at normalcy. The church fair had always been a bright spot in the year, a time when the whole town came together in Christian fellowship. But today was different. Today held the charity bride auction, meant to raise funds for drought relief. The morning crept on, sun climbing higher as more townspeople gathered. Addison's mother stood near the hymn board, lips moving in silent prayer. The familiar sight brought both comfort and a fresh wave of grief. How different this day might have been if Papa were still alive to stand beside them, with his quiet strength and unwavering faith. As noon approached, Reverend Matthews cleared his throat. "Friends and neighbors, let us begin our charitable auction." He mopped his brow with a handkerchief, voice wavering. "We're here to support those hardest hit by the drought." The first few brides stepped forward, young widows and spinsters who'd agreed to participate, mostly in good humor. Their auctions proceeded with reasonable dignity, though Addison noticed the Reverend's increasing discomfort as the bidding grew rowdier with each round. Then it was her turn. Addison forced herself to stand, hands clasped tightly before her. The whispers grew louder, accompanied by poorly concealed snickers. "Reckon we ought to sell her by the pound," called out Tom Wilson, and cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Addison's cheeks burned, but she held herself straight, the way Papa had taught her. "Stand firm in faith," his voice echoed in her memory. "Now, friends," Reverend Matthews started, but his protest was drowned by more jeers. "Might take 2 husbands to handle all of her. Better reinforce that wedding bed." Addison's mother's prayer grew more fervent, her lips moving faster as she clutched her Bible. The autumn breeze felt suddenly cold against Addison's heated face, and she wished she could sink into the ground like a stone in the river. Then the crowd parted. A tall figure strode forward, his movements purposeful as a mountain cat. Jaden Creed's beard couldn't hide the scar that ran along his jaw, and his buckskins bore the wear of hard living in the high country. He said nothing as he approached the table where Reverend Matthews stood. The laughter died in his wake. Addison had seen him before, on his rare trips into town for supplies. He was known to be fair in his dealings, but kept to himself, speaking little. Some said he'd fought in the war and lost his brother there. Others whispered about his friendship with the Shoshone people who still hunted in the mountains. All agreed he was a man best left alone. Now he reached into his coat and withdrew something that gleamed in the sunlight, a gold nugget, heavy and pure. He set it on the table with deliberate care, the thunk of metal on wood loud in the sudden silence. "She's mine now." His voice was deep and quiet, but it carried across the churchyard like thunder. His gray eyes met Addison's, then swept the crowd with a look that dared anyone to speak against him. No one did. The silence hung thick as river fog until Reverend Matthews, perhaps remembering his promise to Addison's father to see her cared for, fumbled through a hasty blessing. May the Lord guide and protect this union." Creed shrugged out of his coat, a well-worn leather garment lined with wool, and wrapped it around Addison's shoulders. The warmth of his body lingered in the fabric, along with the scent of pine smoke and leather. She clutched it close, grateful for the shelter it provided, even as confusion and humiliation warred in her heart. Was this rescue, or simply duty? Did he act from kindness or obligation to her father's memory? They'd never exchanged more than passing greetings in town, yet now she was bound to him by public claim and pastoral blessing. The crowd began to disperse, some looking ashamed, others still smirking. Addison's mother hurried forward, tears in her eyes. "Mr. Creed, Ma'am." He touched his hat brim respectfully. "I'll see her safe." His voice was gentle but firm, brooking no argument. Addison embraced her mother, trying to convey courage she didn't feel. "I'll be fine, Mama, don't worry." The afternoon shadows lengthened across the churchyard as Creed led her to where his mule waited patiently. A sturdy sled was hitched behind it, loaded with supplies. He'd clearly come to town for more than just the fare. He helped her settle on the sled, arranging blankets around her with careful hands that never presumed too much. "Till spring," he said quietly. "Time enough for proper decisions then." Addison nodded, not trusting her voice. As dusk gathered, Creed clicked to his mule, and they started the journey out of town. The bells on the mule's harness chimed softly, a counterpoint to the crunch of wheels on the packed earth. Behind them, lamplight began to glow in the church windows, growing fainter with each step that carried them toward the mountains. Wrapped in Creed's coat, Addison watched the town recede. The familiar buildings that had witnessed her joys and sorrows for 27 years disappeared into the gathering dark. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also, perhaps, a chance at something new. She touched the rough wool of the coat, remembering the quiet strength in Creed's voice when he'd claimed her. Whether from duty or something more, he'd ended her humiliation with 3 simple words. The mule's bells continued their gentle song as they followed the road north toward Creed's homestead in the high country. Addison sat straight-backed on the sled, holding to her father's teachings about faith, even when the path ahead was unclear. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, bright and steady, as Wind River and its whispers faded behind them. The eastern horizon began to blush pink and gold, painting the snow-covered landscape in gentle hues. Addison sat quietly in the sled, wrapped in Jaden's coat and the woolen blankets he'd arranged around her. Despite the layers, the wind found ways to bite through, making her grateful for the thick stockings and sturdy boots she'd worn to the church fair. The mule plodded steadily upward, its breath steaming in the crisp morning air. Bells chimed softly with each step, marking their slow progress into the high country. Addison watched the changing terrain with a mixture of apprehension and wonder. She'd never ventured this far from Wind River before. Jaden walked beside the mule, one hand resting lightly on its harness. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to mountain paths, his boots finding sure purchase even where snow obscured the road. Though he spoke little, his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert to every shadow and sound. "Ridge there," he said, pointing to a sharp line against the brightening sky. "That's Thunder Peak. Storm's building behind it." His voice was low and rough, as if unused to much exercise. "Need to make good time." Addison nodded, appreciating his practical. Focus on their journey rather than their unusual circumstances. The silence between them felt less awkward when filled with necessary information. "Watch there." He indicated a smooth stretch of snow ahead. "Drifts deep, hides rocks." He guided the mule carefully around the hazard, and Addison gripped the sled's edge as it tilted slightly. Later, when the sun had climbed higher, Jaden stopped abruptly. He studied the snow beside the trail, then pointed to a set of large, round prints. "Cougar. Fresh. Passed through before dawn." His hand moved naturally to the rifle slung across his back, though he didn't remove it. "We're all right. He's gone upslope to den." The morning wore on, their elevation steadily increasing. The air grew thinner, making Addison's breaths come faster. She found herself studying her unexpected protector, noting how his buckskins bore careful mending, how his beard was neatly trimmed despite its wild appearance. Everything about him spoke of a man who took care with his responsibilities, however solitary his life might be. Near midday, they reached a small structure nestled against a stand of pine trees. "Line shack," Jaden explained, helping her down from the sled. Her legs trembled from cold and sitting still so long. "Need to warm up. Rest the mule." The line shack was simple but solid, with a stone fireplace and stack of dry wood along one wall. While Jaden tended to the mule, Addison stood in the doorway, taking in the spare furnishings, a rough table, 2 chairs, and shelves holding basic provisions. Jaden worked efficiently, soon having a small fire crackling in the hearth. He set a battered coffee pot at the edge of the flames, then reached into his pack and withdrew a tin of beans. "Not fancy," he said, offering it to her along with a spoon. "But it'll warm you." "Thank you." Addison's fingers brushed his as she took the tin, and she felt the roughness of his calloused hand. She sat in one of the chairs, watching as he poured coffee into 2 tin cups. As she ate, Addison's hand strayed to her pocket, touching her mother's kerchief tucked safely inside. The familiar scent of lavender still clung to it, bringing a sudden wave of homesickness. She blinked back tears, not wanting Jaden to see. But when he handed her the coffee, his gray eyes held understanding. "Hard leaving home," he said quietly, "even when it's needful." They rested only long enough to take the chill off and give the mule a proper break. The afternoon brought them higher into the mountains, where the spruce trees grew thick and blue-tinted in the winter light. Finally, as shadows began to lengthen once more, Jaden pointed ahead. "There, home." His cabin sat in a natural clearing, solidly built of squared timber with a stone chimney. Snow lay thick on the steep-pitched roof, and smoke curled from the chimney. "Nathan, my brother, and I built it," Jaden said, something soft entering his voice at the mention of his brother. "Before the war." He helped Addison down from the sled one final time. Snowflakes had begun to fall, dotting her shawl with white as she stood on the threshold. The door opened to reveal a plain but well-kept interior, A stone hearth with cooking hooks, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves holding provisions and books. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its quilt neat and dark. Jaden efficiently stabled the mule, then brought in their supplies. A scratching at the door heralded the arrival of an old bloodhound, his red-brown coat frosted with snow. "Red," Jaden said by way of introduction. "Good dog, keeps the mountain lions away." The hound approached Addison carefully, sniffing her skirts before wagging his tail once in approval. As full dark settled outside, Jaden lit the lamp and built up the fire. The cabin grew warm and surprisingly cozy, yet tension remained in Addison's shoulders. This was, after all, a man's private home, and she was now alone here with him. Jaden seemed to sense her unease. He stood by the hearth, his tall frame casting long shadows in the lamplight. "Need to speak plain," he said, his voice steady. "You'll take the bed. I'll roll my blankets here by the hearth. Come spring when the pass is clear." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We can set this aside cleanly if you wish. No shame in it. No obligation." Addison felt something tight in her chest ease slightly. He was offering her both safety and choice, more than she'd had at the church fair. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything today." He nodded once, then moved to the door. He left it slightly ajar, and Red promptly settled in the opening, nose pointed toward the shed. The old hound clearly knew his duty. Addison found her traveling bag had been placed beside the bed. She changed quickly into her nightdress while Jaden busied himself banking the fire, his back turned to give her privacy. Then she knelt beside the bed, clasping her hands as she had every night since childhood. "Lord," she whispered, "please grant me clarity. And thank you for sending someone kind." The fire settled with a soft crackle. When Addison looked up from her prayers, she saw Jaden had made his bed of blankets near the hearth. He lay facing the wall, his body wrapped in what seemed as much solitude as wool. The familiar weight of uncertainty pressed on her heart, but it was tempered now by something new, a cautious trust in this quiet man who had offered her both protection and freedom of choice. Outside, snow continued to fall, and Red's steady breathing joined the gentle chorus of fire and wind. Addison slipped under the quilt, which smelled of cedar and wood smoke. Despite her anxieties about what spring might bring, exhaustion soon drew her toward sleep. Her last conscious thought was that perhaps faith could grow in this high, lonely place, like the blue spruce that guarded Jaden's mountain home. Morning light crept through the frost-edged windows, painting pale squares on the cabin's plank floor. Addison woke to the comforting scent of wood smoke and the quiet crackle of a freshly built fire. Jaden must have risen before dawn to tend it. She dressed quickly in the cold air, grateful for the heavy wool of her skirts. The cabin felt different in daylight, smaller, more intimate, yet somehow less threatening than it had seemed the night before. Red, the bloodhound, thumped his tail against the floor in greeting as she moved to the hearth. Finding the cornmeal stored in a ceramic crock, Addison began preparing breakfast. She stirred the meal into boiling water, working out lumps with practiced motions. Through the window, she could see Jaden making his way down the snowy path to the creek, 2 wooden buckets swinging from a yoke across his broad shoulders. The door opened several minutes later, letting in a blast of cold air as Jaden returned with the water. Ice rimmed the bucket's edges, and his breath came out in white puffs. "Creek's starting to freeze," he said, setting the buckets down carefully. "Need to break through now." He shed his heavy coat and reached for the axe leaning by the door. "Got to check traps on the east slope, too. Won't be gone long." "The mush will keep warm," Addison assured him, stirring the thickening mixture. She appreciated how he announced his movements, letting her know his plans. It helped ease the strangeness of their situation. When Jaden returned, his boots were crusted with snow and his beard sparkled with ice crystals. He stamped his feet clean at the threshold, then hung his coat by the fire to dry. The traps had yielded 2 rabbits, which he cleaned efficiently outside before storing them in the cold box built against the cabin's north wall. They sat down to breakfast, steam rising from their bowls. The silence between them felt weighted with unspoken questions about their arrangement. Finally, Jaden cleared his throat. "Been thinking?" he said, stirring his mush slowly. "When spring comes and the pass opens, we can ride to Cheyenne. Judge there owes me a favor from the war years. He'll grant an annulment, quiet-like." He glanced up at her. "No shame to either of us." Addison nodded, grateful for his consideration of her reputation. "That seems wise," she replied softly, though something in her chest tightened at the words. Their quiet morning was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Red lifted his head, ears pricked, but didn't growl. Jaden rose, hand dropping instinctively to the rifle propped nearby, then relaxed as he recognized the visitor through the window. The man who entered wore a heavy buffalo coat, rimed with frost, and his breath came in quick pants from the climb. "Creed," he said, nodding to Jaden. "Mrs. Creed," he added, spotting Addison at the table. His tone held a note of surprise. "Cass Rourke," Jaden introduced him, U.S. land agent for the territory. He gestured to a chair. "Coffee's hot?" Rourke shed his coat and accepted the offered cup gratefully. His weathered face was serious as he withdrew several folded papers from his satchel. "Wish this was just a social call," he said, "but there's trouble coming." Jaden's expression darkened. "Railroad?" Rourke nodded. "Survey crews pushing west. They're claiming timber rights through these valleys." He spread a map across the table, pointing to their location. "Your ridge here. It's prime for railroad ties. Unless—" He hesitated, glancing at Addison's hands folded in her lap. "Unless what?" Jaden's voice was tight with barely contained anger. "Unless it's proved as a family homestead by spring," Rourke continued, "with permanent residence and documented improvements. A real household, you understand?" His emphasis on the word made his meaning clear. A married couple's home, not a bachelor's claim. Jaden's frown deepened, and Addison saw his hands clench briefly before he forced them to relax. The muscle in his jaw worked as he studied the map. "How long?" he asked finally. "Till the spring survey, April, maybe May." Rourke's eyes moved between them. "I'll need to see proof of ongoing improvements, regular reports. Can't have any questions about the legitimacy of the claim." After Rourke departed, the cabin felt colder despite the crackling fire. Addison watched as Jaden stood at the window, staring out at the snow-covered ridge that had been his home for so long. His shoulders were tense beneath his wool shirt. The day passed slowly. Addison kept busy with small tasks, sweeping, mending, preparing a simple stew for supper. As evening approached, she finally spoke. "We need to talk about it." Jaden turned from the window. "Won't ask you to stay," he said roughly. "Not your burden to bear." "But if I don't," she replied carefully, "you'll lose everything you and your brother built." He was silent for a long moment. "Aye." They sat down to supper, the stew steaming in wooden bowls. Addison broke a loaf of bread, passing half to Jaden. "What would it require?" she asked. "To prove the claim?" "Improvements," he said. "Regular work on the land, written records. Rourke would need to see a proper household, shared work, meals together." He paused. "Morning and evening prayers, like decent folk." Addison considered this as she ate. The arrangement would be a pretense, yes, but one that might save Jaden's home while providing her shelter through the winter. And come spring, "Until the pass opens," she said finally, "we present a true household. Keep records of improvements. Give Mr. Rourke no reason to doubt." Jaden studied her face in the lamplight. "You're certain?" She nodded. "It seems right. To help if I can." They finished their meal in thoughtful silence. Later, as they banked the fire for the night, Addison felt the weight of their decision. This pretense of marriage would require a careful dance between propriety and necessity. Already she could feel it tugging at her heart, making her wonder if maintaining the facade would be as simple as they imagined. Jaden moved to his blankets by the hearth, while Addison knelt for her evening prayers. Red settled in his usual spot by the door, and the fire popped softly in the gathering dark. Tomorrow they would begin their careful deception, not just for the land agent's benefit, but for their own peace of mind as well. Snow pressed heavy against the cabin windows, thick flakes drifting down in endless waves. The morning light filtered weakly through the glass, casting pale shadows across the wooden floor. Addison had just finished washing the breakfast dishes when Jaden came in from the shed, stamping snow from his boots and carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. He approached the table with careful steps, unwrapping what proved to be an old leather Bible. The binding was worn smooth at the corners, its pages gilded with age. Without speaking, he set it before her and stepped back, his expression guarded. Addison's fingers trembled as she opened the cover. There, on the flyleaf, she recognized the familiar slant of her father's handwriting. The ink had faded to brown, but the words remained clear. "If Jaden Creed ever claims my daughter, he does so with my blessing." Her breath caught in her throat. The room seemed to tilt slightly as she traced the letters with shaking fingers. "When?" she whispered, not looking up. Jaden cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "Your father's last days. Summer before last." He moved to stand by the window, staring out at the falling snow. "He knew he was failing. Asked me to make a promise." Addison's heart thundered in her chest. "What kind of promise?" "To watch over you," Jaden said quietly. "If ever the wolves circled." His shoulders tensed beneath his wool shirt. "Said he'd seen how some treated you in town. Worried what might happen once he was gone." The revelation stung, sharp and unexpected. Addison closed the Bible carefully, her thoughts whirling. Had Jaden acted at the church fair purely out of obligation? A deathbed promise kept? The idea that her rescue might have been mere duty rather than choice made her chest ache. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "to understand this." Jaden nodded, still facing the window. "Take what you need." The morning's quiet was broken by a low rumble of thunder. Dark clouds were rolling in from the west, heavy with the promise of storm. Jaden's expression shifted to concern as he studied the sky. "Bad one coming," he said, already moving toward the door. "Need to prepare." They worked through the early afternoon with steady purpose. Jaden split juniper logs until the wood box overflowed, while Addison filled every water barrel from the creek. The wind picked up, driving the snow sideways as they checked the rabbit traps and secured the livestock in the barn. By the time they returned to the cabin, the storm was hammering the roof with fierce determination. The temperature dropped steadily as afternoon faded into evening. They worked in companionable silence, adding extra quilts to the bed and banking the fire against the coming night. Addison noticed a torn quilt among the bedding and retrieved her sewing basket. As she spread the damaged fabric across her lap, Jaden paused in his work by the fire. "Know how to mend that?" he asked, nodding towards the tear. "The basic way," she replied, "though it won't be pretty." He pulled his chair closer, surprising her. "Show you a cabin stitch, stronger for heavy use." His fingers, rough from trapping and woodwork, demonstrated the technique with unexpected grace. "Learned it from my mother, before the fever took her." Addison watched carefully, then tried the stitch herself. Her first attempts were clumsy, but Jaden's patient guidance helped her improve. As they worked together on the quilt, she found herself humming softly, an old hymn her father had loved. "Know that one?" Jaden said, looking up from the mending. "First verse, anyway." "I could teach you the second," Addison offered. The words came easily, her clear voice rising above the storm's growl. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." Jaden listened intently, his expression softening as she sang. When she finished, he repeated the verse carefully until he had it memorized. The simple act of sharing the hymn seemed to ease some of the tension that had built between them since the morning's revelation. The storm kept them inside for 2 days, its steady white drum against the walls marking time's passage. They fell into a rhythm of necessary tasks, tending the fire, preparing meals, mending what needed fixing. Addison found herself watching Jaden when he wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the gruff mountain man with someone who would keep a years-old promise to her father. On the second night, as the wind began to slacken, Addison picked up her father's Bible again. The leather was warm under her fingers as she opened to the Psalms. Her voice was soft but steady as she began to read. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Jaden sat in his chair by the fire, eyes closed, listening. The lamplight cast warm shadows across his face, softening the scar that traced his beard line. As Addison continued reading, the storm's fury gradually diminished to a gentle whisper against the windows. In its place, a different kind of warmth seemed to fill the room, something that felt almost like hope, quiet and tentative as the first spring thaw. Red, the bloodhound, thumped his tail contentedly against the floor. The fire popped softly in the hearth, and outside, the world grew still. Addison kept reading, each familiar verse a bridge between past and present, between duty and whatever might be, growing in its place. Morning light sparkled across the fresh snowfall, transforming the world into a glittering wonderland. The storm had left behind drifts that resembled giant frosted loaves of bread, pristine and untouched. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the cabin's eaves, catching the sun and throwing tiny rainbows against the snow. Addison stood in the doorway, adjusting the borrowed boots Jaden had found for her in the shed. They were a bit large, stuffed with extra wool socks to make them fit, but they would keep her feet dry. She watched as Jaden carved the first path through the deep snow, his broad shoulders working steadily with the wooden shovel. "Come learn how it's done," he called over his shoulder. "Need to pack it firm so it don't drift back in." Addison stepped carefully into his tracks, accepting the spare shovel he handed her. The snow was deeper than she'd expected, reaching past her knees in places. Jaden showed her how to lift and toss the snow to one side, creating walls that would help keep the path clear. "Like this?" she asked, mimicking his technique. "That's the way," he nodded, approval warming his voice. "Got to angle it just so, or it'll blow right back in come nightfall." They worked their way to the woodpile, where Jaden demonstrated how to split kindling properly. "Watch the grain," he instructed, positioning a piece of pine. "Follow nature's lines, and it'll break clean." The wood separated with a satisfying crack under his axe. Addison tried next, her first attempts glancing off at awkward angles. But Jaden was patient, adjusting her grip and stance until she found the rhythm. Soon she had a neat pile of kindling at her feet. "You're a quick study," he remarked, gathering the wood into his arms. Red, Jaden's old bloodhound, had followed them outside and now pressed against Addison's leg, seeking attention. She scratched behind his ears, earning a grateful thump of his tail against the snow. The dog had taken to following her everywhere these past days, a silent guardian with soulful eyes. After the woodpile, Jaden led her into the sparse forest beyond the cabin, showing her how to set rabbit snares. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he demonstrated the proper way to loop the wire. "Not too tight," he explained, "but snug enough to hold. Place them where you see tracks crossing, like here, see?" He pointed to the delicate impressions in the snow where rabbits had passed. Back in the cabin's warmth, Addison set about making biscuits for their midday meal. The first batch burned on the bottom, filling the cabin with the acrid smell of scorched flour. She frowned at the blackened discs, but Jaden just scraped them clean and ate them anyway. "Waste not," he said simply, though his eyes crinkled with amusement. Determined, Addison tried again. This time she watched the stove more carefully, adjusting the heat. When she pulled the second batch from the oven, they were perfect, golden brown and fluffy inside. As they sat down to eat, Jaden awkwardly attempted to say, "Grace," stumbling over the familiar hymn's words. Addison's voice joined his, warm and encouraging, helping him find the rhythm. Red lay between them, his tail sweeping the floor contentedly as they shared the meal. After the dishes were cleared, Jaden brought out a leather-bound ledger and set it on the table. "Need to keep careful record," he explained, opening to a fresh page. "Every tree felled, every shingle split, every day we're here, it all counts toward proving the claim." Addison leaned closer, studying the neat columns he'd drawn. "For the land agent?" "Yes, got to show we're working the land proper, making improvements." He dipped his pen and began to write, recording the morning's work. "Date everything careful-like. Clerk's got to be able to read it clear as day." Together they marked the date and listed their activities. Paths cleared, wood split, snares set. Addison's handwriting was neater than his, so she took over recording their daily accomplishments, while he dictated the details that needed to be included. The days that followed settled into a steady rhythm. Each morning brought new tasks, learning to bank the fire just right, keeping the water barrel from freezing, mending tools worn from constant use. Though the air remained bitter cold, the skies stayed clear, allowing them to establish routines that slowly began to feel natural. 4 evenings later, they sat in the lamp's golden glow after supper. Addison held one of Jaden's wool shirts in her lap, carefully darning a tear in the elbow. Her stitches were small and even, nearly invisible against the dark fabric. Across from her, Jaden's knife moved steadily over a piece of pine, shaping it into a spoon. "It's for your mother," he explained, holding it up to examine his progress. "Thought she might like something made from the trees up here." Addison looked up from her mending, touched by the gesture. "She would love that. She always said a handmade gift carries part of the maker's heart." They fell into comfortable silence, broken only by the soft scrape of the knife and the crackle of the fire. Red dozed between them, occasionally sighing in his sleep. "Come spring," Jaden said after a while, "might be good to put in a kitchen garden. South side of the cabin gets good sun." Addison's hands stilled on the shirt. "What would you plant?" "Carrots grow well up here. Peas too, if we get them in early enough. Maybe some herbs for cooking." It was just talk. The ground was still frozen solid under feet of snow, but it felt like something more, like a promise, or at least the possibility of one. Addison finished the last few stitches and tied off her thread, examining her work with satisfaction. Rising, she crossed to the shelf where Jaden had been collecting items for her mother. The nearly finished spoon, a small bag of pine nuts, a length of soft tanned deerskin. She arranged them carefully, touched by how he thought of her family's needs even in the midst of their own daily concerns. The lamp was burning low, its flame flickering against the glass. Addison turned down the wick, letting the shadows soften around them. In the dimness, she offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for these small mercies, warm shelter, honest work, and whatever gentle thing was growing between them, as quiet and steady as the winter stars. Red's tail thumped against the floorboards, a drowsy rhythm in the gathering dark. Outside, an owl called once, its voice carrying clear and sharp through the cold night air. Inside, the fire settled with a soft sigh of sparks, banking itself for the long hours until dawn. A week passed, marked by quiet routine and lengthening days. The morning sun had barely lifted above the eastern ridge when Jaden stepped out to harness the mule for their supply run to town. Frost sparkled on the leather traces as he worked, his breath clouding in the crisp air. Addison appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her warmest clothes. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly, wrapping her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders. Jaden paused, hand stilling on the harness. "You sure? Trail's rough, and townfolk can be rougher." "I'm sure." Her chin lifted with quiet determination. "They need to see I stand by my husband, and I want to visit Mother." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Reckon you're right." He helped her onto the sled bench, making sure she was settled before climbing up beside her. Red whined from the cabin porch, but Jaden whistled him back. "Guard the house, boy." The mule's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they started down the mountain track. Jaden handled the reins with careful attention, guiding them around the worst drifts and ice patches. The winter silence wrapped around them, broken only by the creak of leather and the soft jingle of harness bells. Near midday, they stopped at Crow Creek to rest the mule. The water ran swift beneath a skin of ice, its voice muffled but persistent. Jaden broke through the edge with his axe to let the animal drink. "Beautiful, ain't it?" Addison said softly, gazing at the ice-rimmed branches that arched over the creek. "Like God hung crystal curtains." Jaden's expression softened as he looked where she pointed. "Never thought of it that way. But you're right." They reached Wind River by mid-afternoon, the town's scattered buildings throwing long shadows across the snow. People turned to watch as they passed, their whispers following like wind through dry grass. Some faces showed kindness now, where there had been only mockery before. Others still held judgment in their eyes. "The Creeds," Addison heard one woman murmur to another. "They say she's keeping house proper up there." "Well, if anyone could manage that mountain, it'd be the preacher's girl." Jaden pulled the sled up in front of her mother's small house. "Take your time," he said. "I'll see to the trading." Addison's mother met her at the door with open arms. "My girl," she breathed, holding Addison tight. "Come in where it's warm." Inside, over steaming cups of tea, Addison brought out the gifts from the mountain. The carefully whittled spoon, smooth as silk beneath her fingers. The bag of pine nuts, the soft deerskin. Her mother touched each item with reverent care. "He made these?" she asked, running her thumb along the spoon's graceful curve. "Yes, in the evenings, after chores." Addison explained about the homestead claim, the ledger they kept, the careful balance they maintained. "We're doing everything proper, Mother, making it real and legal." Her mother's eyes misted as she reached for Addison's hand. "Honor first," she said softly. "Your father would be proud." She squeezed Addison's fingers. "Are you safe? Truly?" "Yes," Addison answered without hesitation. "He's been nothing but respectful, keeps his distance, treats me with care." Meanwhile, Jaden moved through his trading with efficient purpose. At the fur trader's shop, he exchanged his carefully prepared pelts for credit, then carried his list to the mercantile: flour, coffee, kerosene for the lamps, nails for the improvements they planned. He was loading the supplies onto the sled when Orrin Pike's shadow fell across his work. The banker's son stood with thumbs hooked in his vest, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Quite a load you bought there, Creed," Pike drawled, eyeing the goods. "Heavy burden, ain't it? Rather like some other purchases made recently." Jaden's hands stilled on the flour sack. Before he could respond, Addison appeared at his side, her fingers light but firm on his sleeve. She'd heard Pike's words as she approached. "Mr. Pike," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I trust you're well?" Pike's smirk faltered slightly at her calm dignity. He opened his mouth for another barb, but Jaden was already turning away, Addison's hand still on his arm. They walked together to the church, leaving Pike standing in the street with his undelivered insult. They stabled the mule in the church barn, then slipped into the back pew for evening prayers. The service was brief, the small congregation's voices rising in familiar hymns as darkness gathered outside. Addison sang clear and true. Beside her, Jaden stood silent but attentive, his hat held respectfully in his hands. Before full dark could settle, they were on the road again, the sled runners whispering through fresh powder. The first stars pricked through the deep blue sky, their light cold and pure above the mountains. Addison shivered slightly, and without a word, slid closer to Jaden on the bench. He reached down and tucked the heavy blanket more securely around her knees, his movements careful to maintain proper distance even as he sheltered her from the wind. The mountains rose before them, their familiar shapes welcome against the star-filled sky. Like old friends, they seemed to reach out and draw the sled home into their waiting shadows. The mule's steady pace carried them higher, hooves finding the path by memory through the gathering night. Jaden handled the reins with sure hands, guiding them around the worst of the drifts. The cold grew sharper as they climbed, but Addison felt warm enough, wrapped in wool and the quiet strength of her husband's presence beside her. Home, she thought, watching the stars wheel overhead. The word felt different now, shaped by new meaning. Home was waiting ahead, a cabin bright with lamplight, a dog's welcome bark, shared work and careful courtesy. Not what she'd dreamed of, perhaps, but solid as the mountains themselves. The sled runners sang through the snow, carrying them steadily upward into the embracing night. 2 mornings after their return from town, the crisp mountain air carried the distant sound of hoofbeats up the snow-packed trail. Addison looked up from where she was sweeping the cabin's plank floor, her breath catching at the sight of Agent Rourke's sorrel gelding through the window frost. "Jaden," she called softly. Her husband appeared in the doorway, axe in hand from his morning's work. The land agent dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd ridden far. His breath clouded in the cold as he tipped his hat to Addison, who stood now in the doorway. "Ma'am, Mr. Creed, hope I'm not interrupting your morning's work." "Just finished splitting the day's wood," Jaden said, setting his axe against the wall. "Come in where it's warm." Inside, Rourke's keen eyes took in every detail: the swept floor, the organized shelves, the Bible and ledger prominent on the table. The agent removed his gloves slowly, warming his hands by the pot-bellied stove, where a pot of coffee simmered. "I'll need to inspect the improvements you've made," Rourke said, accepting the cup Addison offered. "Railroad's pushing hard on these claims. Need everything documented proper." Jaden nodded, reaching for his coat. "We'll show you around." Outside, the morning sun caught the ice crystals in the air, making them dance like diamond dust. Rourke followed as Jaden led him to the newly stacked woodpile, the neat rows measuring their winter's warmth. "Split and stacked by hand," Jaden explained, running a calloused palm over the seasoned logs. "Keep track of every hour in the ledger." They moved to the cabin's side, where fresh-cut timber braced a repaired eave. Rourke made notes in his small book, asking about dates and methods. The new root cellar door came next, its sturdy planks still showing pale against the weathered wood around it. "Mrs. Creed," Rourke turned to Addison, who stood wrapped in her shawl nearby. "Would you tell me about your daily household routines?" Addison's voice carried quiet confidence as she answered. "We rise at first light, share morning prayers while the stove warms, breakfast together before Jaden sees to outside work. I tend to indoor tasks, cooking, cleaning, mending." She gestured to the cabin. "We take our evening meal at sunset, then read from scripture before retiring." "And you maintain the improvement ledger together?" "Yes, sir. Every evening we record the day's work, both our hands in the book, showing what's been done." Rourke nodded, jotting another note. Back inside, he spread preliminary homestead papers on the table. Jaden read each page carefully before signing, his usually sure hand showing extra care with the pen. Addison witnessed each signature, her own neat script flowing beneath his. "These establish your initial claim," Rourke explained, sorting the documents. "But remember, railroad men are like winter wolves. They'll probe for weakness, looking for any excuse to challenge your residency." He looked between them seriously. "A family's visible presence is your strongest defense. They need to see this as a true household, not just papers in a file." Addison poured more coffee, the steam rising like morning prayers. "We understand, Mr. Rourke. We're building something real here." The agent's weathered face softened slightly at her words. He finished his coffee standing, as if already thinking of the long ride ahead. At the door, he turned to Addison with a respectful nod. "Ma'am, you've made this place a proper home." They watched him ride away, his horse's tracks adding to the story written in the snow around their cabin. The sun had climbed higher, promising a clear day for work. Jaden brought out his shaving horse, setting it up where the morning light would guide his hands. Soon the steady scrape of the draw knife filled the air as he milled rough boards smooth. The wood curled away in pale ribbons, each stroke revealing the grain beneath. Inside, Addison spread heavy fabric on the table, measuring carefully before cutting. The new curtains would help seal warmth around the windows when night winds blew. Her needle flashed in the light, each stitch a small argument against winter's chill. The day passed in the rhythm of shared work, the rasp of Jaden's tools, the whisper of Addison's thread, the comfortable silence between them broken only by necessary words. Red moved between them, settling first by one, then the other, his tail thumping contentedly on the packed snow. Twilight came early, as it always did in the mountains. They brought their work inside, where the stove's warmth pushed back the gathering dark. Jaden lit the lamp while Addison set out bread and soup for their evening meal. After they'd eaten, Jaden brought out the ledger. They sat close to the lamp's circle of light, recording the day's accomplishments. Their hands moved across the page, leaving ink-smudged fingerprints like private marks of belonging. 6 hours milling boards, Jaden muttered as he wrote. Weather clear, temperature below freezing. New curtains begun, Addison added, her own fingers stained with ink. Double-stitched for durability. She paused, looking at their entries side by side on the page. "This looks like a marriage," she said softly, almost to herself. Jaden's hand stilled on the page. He met her gaze, his eyes holding something gentle in their depths. "Feels like mercy," he answered, his voice low and warm as banked coals. Together they closed the ledger, placing it carefully beneath the Bible on the table. Law under grace, as if the weight of one held the other steady. The lamp flame wavered as Addison banked the stove for the night, casting their shadows large against the walls of their shared home. Night fell hard across the mountain, bringing sleet that rattled against the cabin windows like thrown pebbles. Addison stirred the soup hanging over the banked fire, while Jaden checked his snare lines one last time before dark. The weather had turned mean, the kind that made even the strongest seek shelter. Red's head snapped up from where he dozed by the hearth. His ears pricked forward, and then he launched into sudden, urgent barking that made Addison jump. The hound rushed to the door, pawing at the wood. "What is it, boy?" Jaden crossed to the entrance, rifle in hand. He cracked the door against the wind, letting in a blast of icy air. Through the swirling sleet, a small, dark shape emerged from the trees. It stumbled, fell, then pushed up again on trembling arms. Jaden's rifle clattered against the wall as he rushed out into the storm. He returned moments later carrying a child, small and limp as a rag doll. "Tommy Brandt," Jaden said, his voice tight with worry. "Logger's boy. His hands are white with cold." Addison's heart clenched at the sight of the boy's blue-tinged lips. She grabbed blankets while Jaden set the child, no more than 8 years old, in the chair closest to the stove. "We need to warm him slow," she said, remembering her father's warnings about frostbite. "Too fast could hurt him worse." She hurried to heat towels by the stove, while Jaden carefully removed Tommy's frozen boots and socks. The boy's feet were angry red, but his hands worried them most, pale as paper, stiff as wood. "Easy now, son," Jaden murmured, beginning to rub Tommy's fingers with gentle, steady pressure. "We don't want to blister them." His large hands moved with surprising tenderness over the boy's smaller ones. Addison wrapped the warm towels around Tommy's feet, then heated more for his core. The boy's eyes fluttered but didn't open. His brown hair was crusted with ice, melting now in the cabin's warmth. "Got to keep him awake if we can," Jaden said. "Tommy, can you hear me, boy?" A faint moan answered him. Addison ladled hot broth into a cup, cooling it with a breath before bringing it to Tommy's lips. "Small sips," she encouraged. "That's right." Through the windy night, they took shifts caring for the child. When Jaden stoked the fire and changed the towels, Addison spooned broth and spoke soft encouragement. When she warmed more towels, Jaden rubbed life back into cold limbs and told quiet stories of friendly bears and clever foxes. Between chattering teeth, Tommy mumbled about a white mare that had spooked and bolted. "Uncle's lantern died in the dark," he whispered. "Couldn't find the trail." "You're safe now," Addison soothed, stroking his hair. "God led you to our light." Red stayed close, his warm body pressed against Tommy's legs, his brown eyes watching every movement. The old hound seemed to understand his duty was to help guard this small life through the dark hours. Outside, the sleet gradually softened to snow, falling in gentle feathers against the window glass. The wind's howl mellowed to a whisper, as if nature herself had tired of her fury. Near dawn, Jaden settled in the rocker, exhaustion finally claiming him. His head nodded forward, hands still half raised as if reaching to tend the fire. Addison tucked another blanket around Tommy's shoulders. The boy's color was better, his breathing deeper and more regular. She began to hum, "Blessed Assurance," the melody as soft as a mother's breath against a fevered brow. The familiar hymn filled the cabin with peace, wrapping around them like a quilt of sound. "Jesus is mine," she whispered the words between verses, rocking slightly as she sat beside Tommy's chair. Perfect submission. All is at rest. The first rays of sunrise seeped through the frost-laced windows, painting the cabin's walls with pale gold. Tommy stirred, his eyes opening clear and aware. His small hand reached out, gripping Addison's wrist with surprising strength. "Ma'am?" His voice was hoarse but steady. Addison smiled, relief washing through her like a spring tide. "Welcome back, Tommy," she said softly. Jaden woke at the sound, coming instantly alert as years in the wilderness had taught him. He crossed to them, his hand warm and strong on Addison's shoulder. "We'll get him home today," he whispered, and she nodded. They worked together preparing for the journey ahead, Addison wrapping journey bread and filling a flask with hot tea, while Jaden checked the sled's runners and harness. Tommy sat at their table, wrapped in blankets, watching with tired eyes as he ate the breakfast Addison had prepared. "The snow's good for sledding," Jaden said, helping Tommy into Addison's spare wool socks. "We'll have you back to your folks before dinner time." "Yes, sir," Tommy said. "Thank you, sir, ma'am." His eyes were bright with gratitude and something else, perhaps wonder at finding such kindness in the wilderness. Addison packed extra blankets while Jaden hitched the mule. The morning spread clear before them, the storm's fury replaced by pristine white peace. New snow draped every branch and rock, as if God himself had laid out a fresh, clean path for their journey. They bundled Tommy between them on the sled seat, wrapped so thoroughly that only his eyes showed above the scarves. Red settled at their feet, his warm bulk adding another layer of protection against the cold. The sun climbed higher as they prepared to depart, promising fair weather for their careful trip down the mountain. "Ready?" Jaden asked, gathering the reins. Addison checked Tommy's wrappings one last time, then nodded. The boy's rescue had shown her something about Jaden, and perhaps about herself, that went beyond their careful arrangement of convenience. In the night's shared vigil, she'd glimpsed the true heart of the man who had claimed her at the church fair, and it left her wondering about God's mysterious ways of answering prayers. The mule's harness jingled as they prepared to start their journey. Tommy's parents would be frantic with worry, and there was no time to waste. Yet in this moment, as the morning light sparkled on new snow, Addison felt a curious peace. They had done good work this night, she and Jaden together, and somehow that seemed to matter more than all their careful documentation of improvements and claims. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow as Jaden guided the mule-drawn sled down the mountain path. He kept the pace deliberate and gentle, mindful of every bump that might jar their young passenger. Tommy sat between them, bundled in layers of wool and wrapped in Addison's patchwork quilt, only his bright eyes visible above the scarves. "How are you faring, Tommy?" Addison asked, tucking the blanket tighter around his shoulders. "Better, ma'am," he answered, his voice stronger than it had been during the night. "My fingers don't hurt so much now." Jaden nodded with approval. "That's good news, son. We'll have you home soon enough." The journey that usually took 2 hours stretched longer as they navigated carefully around drifts and ice-slick portions of the trail. Red trotted alongside, breaking trail through deeper snow, his red-gold coat dusted white. The dog seemed to understand their mission, staying close to the sled as if helping to guard their precious cargo. As they approached Wind River, the church bell began to toll 10 o'clock, its clear notes carrying across the snow-hushed landscape. The sound drew people from their morning tasks, and word of their arrival spread quickly through town. By the time Jaden pulled the sled to a stop near the church steps, a small crowd had gathered. "Tommy!" A man's anguished cry split the air. Tommy's uncle burst through the group, his face haggard from a night of searching. Behind him came Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher who had been helping organize search parties since dawn. "Uncle Joe," Tommy called back, struggling to free himself from his wrappings. Jaden helped him down from the sled, steadying the boy as his uncle swept him into a fierce embrace. "Thank God," the uncle choked out, holding Tommy tight. "We feared the worst when your mare came back without you." He looked up at Jaden and Addison, his eyes brimming. "How can we ever repay you?" "No payment needed," Jaden said firmly. "Any soul would have done the same." Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his weathered face creased with relief. "The Lord guided this child to your doorstep, brother." He clasped Jaden's hand, then turned to address the gathering crowd. "Friends, we have witnessed a miracle of providence. I propose we hold a baptism of thanksgiving this very afternoon, to praise God for Tommy's safe return." Murmurs of approval rippled through the townspeople. The Reverend continued, "Mr. Creed, will you and your wife join us for the service?" "My wife and I would be honored," Jaden answered without hesitation, his voice carrying clear and strong under the church eaves. Addison felt warmth bloom in her chest at how naturally those words, "my wife," flowed from his lips. The crowd's mood had shifted noticeably from their last visit to town. Several women approached Addison, touching her sleeve in gratitude, their earlier whispers replaced by genuine smiles. "You must tell us how you kept the poor boy warm," Mrs. Peterson said, squeezing Addison's hand. "Such a blessing you were there." From the corner of her eye, Addison noticed Orrin Pike watching from the bank's front porch. His face was a mask of calculated calm, but his eyes narrowed as he observed the town's changing attitude. He turned sharply and disappeared inside the bank without a word. The baptismal service was hastily arranged for 2 o'clock. Tommy's parents arrived from their homestead, alerted by riders, and the church filled with those eager to give thanks for the boy's safe return. Addison sat beside Jaden in the front pew, aware of how different this felt from that humiliating day at the church fair. Now she held her head high, secure in the knowledge that their home had been a sanctuary when needed most. During the ceremony, Reverend Matthews spoke of divine providence and the sacred duty of helping neighbors. When he sprinkled the baptismal water, Jaden bowed his head in prayer. Addison felt tears prick her eyes, not from shame this time, but from a deep sense of being seen and known by God. The congregation's amen swelled like a wave of acceptance. After the service, the churchwomen had prepared a celebratory meal in the kitchen. Steam rose from pots of rabbit stew and loaves of fresh bread. Addison found herself welcomed into their circle as she helped serve, sharing details of how she and Jaden had tended Tommy through the night. The story of their careful warming of his frozen hands and feet, their patient spoonfuls of broth, and their vigil of prayer touched hearts that had once been cold toward her. "You've made a real home up there," Tommy's mother said softly, her eyes full of gratitude. "A true Christian household." Before heading back to their cabin, Jaden and Addison stopped at the mercantile to purchase supplies: salt for preserving, needles for mending, and extra coffee for the coming weeks. The shopkeeper's wife slipped an extra packet of peppermint candy into their order with a conspiratorial wink. As the afternoon light began to fade, they prepared for the journey home. Tommy's family came to bid them farewell once more, the boy now properly dressed in warm clothes from home. "Thank you again," he said shyly, pressing something into Addison's hand, a carved wooden horse, simple but sweet. "Uncle Joe helped me make it while we waited for the service." They left town with the setting sun painting the snow in shades of rose and gold, unaware of the shadow that lingered behind them. In the telegraph office, Orrin Pike stood watching their departure through the window. His face was set in lines of calculated determination as he turned to the operator. "Send this complaint to the Territorial Marshal's office," he instructed, sliding a carefully worded message across the desk. The paper alleged kidnapping for dowry, citing unnatural influence over a woman of means. The operator's keys began to clack through the gathering dusk, each sharp click another strand in the snare Orrin was setting. The sun dipped below the western peaks as Jaden and Addison's sled disappeared into the trees. Their breath frosted in the cooling air, and Addison tucked herself closer to Jaden's side for warmth. The day's events had left her feeling more secure than ever in their arrangement, even as unseen danger gathered behind them like storm clouds on the horizon. The telegraph operator's fingers continued their steady work, translating Orrin's malice into dots and dashes that raced along the wire. In the growing darkness, the message sparked its way toward distant offices, where men of law would soon begin asking questions about the mountain man and his bride. Dawn painted the snow-laden branches in shades of pearl when 3 horses picked their way up the mountain trail. Sheriff Amos Kilburn led the way, his weathered face grim beneath his hat brim. Behind him rode Deputies Mason and Taylor, their breath frosting in the cold morning air. Red's warning bark alerted the cabin's occupants before the lawmen reached the yard. Jaden stepped onto the porch, his expression changing from welcome to wariness as he recognized their official bearing. Addison appeared in the doorway behind him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning, Jaden," Sheriff Kilburn said, dismounting with a grunt. His good eye held sympathy, but his stance was all business. "Got some matters to discuss?" "Sheriff." Jaden nodded, noting how the deputies' hands stayed near their gun belts. "What brings you up the mountain?" Kilburn pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Got a warrant here, signed by Judge Harrison down to Cheyenne. There's been accusations filed." "What kind of accusations?" Addison stepped forward, her voice sharp with concern. "Ma'am." The sheriff touched his hat brim. "Complaint alleges improper influence and coercion regarding your marriage arrangement. Judge wants a proper hearing to settle things legal-like." "That's ridiculous." Addison's cheeks flushed with anger. "I'm here by my own choice. Nobody forced anything." "All the same," Kilburn said, "we need Mr. Creed to come to town and answer these charges proper." Jaden's shoulders tensed, but his voice remained steady. "No need for weapons, boys. Don't scare the lady." He raised his palms, showing empty hands. "I'll come peaceful, on my word." The deputies relaxed slightly, though they maintained their positions. Sheriff Kilburn nodded. "Much obliged, Jaden. You can gather what you need." "I'll get your coat," Addison said, disappearing inside. Her hands trembled as she collected Jaden's heavy wool coat and the leather-bound Bible. Through the window, she could see the sheriff speaking quietly to Jaden, likely explaining procedures. When she returned to the porch, Jaden was explaining about the livestock. "Red needs feeding, and there's traps to check." "I'll tend everything," Addison interrupted firmly. "You just focus on clearing this up." She helped him into his coat, pressing the Bible into his hands. Their eyes met, volumes passing in that silent exchange. "Ma'am," Sheriff Kilburn said kindly, "you might want to arrange somewhere in town to stay during the proceedings." Addison nodded, already forming plans. She ducked back inside and quickly packed a burlap sack with essentials, fresh bread, a warm blanket, and most importantly, their homestead ledger. Every entry would help prove their legitimate household. In the doorway, she reached for Jaden's hands. Without shame or hesitation, she pressed her lips to his rough knuckles. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her gaze held steady. "I'll see you soon," she promised. Jaden's throat worked. Take care of Red, he managed. The morning sun cast long shadows as the lawmen's horses carried them down the trail, Jaden riding double with Deputy Taylor. Addison watched until they disappeared among the trees, then squared her shoulders and went inside to change into her town dress. There was work to be done. By early afternoon, Jaden was secured in the town jail, a small but solid building behind the sheriff's office. Addison wasted no time. Her first stop was the Brandt homestead, where Tommy's family readily agreed to host her mother during the proceedings. After what you did for our boy, Eli Brandt said gruffly. Least we can do? His wife nodded emphatic agreement. Next came the church, where Reverend Matthews received her in his study. Of course I'll testify, he assured her, already drafting a statement about the recent baptismal service and Jaden's obvious care for his wife's reputation. The land agent's office proved more difficult to find, but Cass Rourke's reaction made the search worthwhile. Got my inspection notes right here, he said, pulling out a thick ledger. Proper household, clear as day. I'll speak to that. At the post office, old Mr. Henderson remembered delivering mail addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Creed at their mountain address. Regular as clockwork they've been, he declared, promising to document the fact. Addison's feet ached by the time she reached the sheriff's office. Kilburn looked up from his desk as she entered. He's comfortable as can be made, ma'am, he said before she could ask. Brought him coffee and a proper supper earlier. Thank you, she said softly. May I see him? The sheriff considered, then nodded. 5 minutes. Mason will supervise. Jaden stood when she appeared at the cell door. The late afternoon light filtering through the barred window caught the silver in his beard. You should be resting, he chided gently. I'm gathering proof, she told him, voice low but fierce. The ledger shows our daily life. Agent Rourke will testify about inspecting a true household, the preacher's writing his statement about the baptism service, and your Bible, Papa's blessing written clear as day in his own hand. Jaden's eyes softened. You're something else, Addison Wade. Creed, she corrected firmly. Addison Creed. Deputy Mason cleared his throat. Time's up, folks. Addison squeezed Jaden's hand through the bars. The hearing's at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Have faith. Evening shadows were stretching across the street when Addison finally reached the parsonage. The preacher's wife had prepared the spare room, adding extra quilts against the winter chill. After a simple supper of bread and soup, Addison retired early to prepare for the next day. Kneeling beside the narrow bed, she closed her eyes. Her prayer came from deep in her heart, words flowing like water. Lord, guide my words tomorrow. Let truth shine clear as morning light. And Father, she hesitated, then continued firmly, thank you for sending me a good man, even if some can't see his worth yet. Rising, she carefully laid out her best dress, the dark blue wool she'd worn to her father's funeral. It seemed fitting somehow, as if his presence would be with her tomorrow through the fabric, and his written blessing both. The town clock struck 9 as Addison climbed into bed. Through the window she could see stars scattered like salt across the winter sky. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight she felt oddly peaceful. Her last thoughts before sleep claimed her were of Jaden's quiet strength, and the certainty that God had led them both to this moment. The hearing waited just hours away, but Addison had done all she could to prepare. Her evidence was gathered, her witnesses ready, and her heart sure of its course. Sleep came swiftly, deep and dreamless, as the night wrapped around Wind River like a dark shawl. The Wind River courthouse stood silent in the crisp morning air as 10 o'clock struck. Frost patterns decorated the windows like delicate lace, and despite the pot-bellied stove in the corner, breath hung visible in the chilly air. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of townsfolk who had come to witness the proceedings. Judge Harrison, his gray beard neatly trimmed, adjusted his spectacles and called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The sound echoed in the hushed room like gunshots. This court will hear testimony regarding allegations of coercion and improper influence in the matter of creed versus territory, he announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. Mr. Pike, you may present your complaint. Orrin Pike rose from his chair, brushing invisible dust from his fine wool coat. His polished boots clicked against the floorboards as he approached the bench. Every gesture was calculated, each word measured with precise venom wrapped in civility. Your Honor, he began, I speak as a concerned citizen. Miss Wade, I cannot bring myself to use the other name, has been victim of a shocking scheme. His voice dripped false sympathy. A vulnerable woman, pressured into an arrangement through public humiliation and financial manipulation. The so-called marriage was nothing more than a crude transaction designed to secure property rights through deception. Whispers rustled through the crowd like dry leaves. Addison sat straight-backed beside her mother, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Jaden, seated between 2 deputies, kept his eyes fixed steadily ahead. The defendant, Pike continued, gesturing toward Jaden, took advantage of a charitable event to essentially purchase. That will do, Mr. Pike, Judge Harrison interrupted. The court understands your position. He turned his level gaze to Addison. Mrs. Creed, please approach. Addison rose with quiet dignity. Her blue wool dress whispered against the floorboards as she walked forward, carrying a leather satchel. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the copper highlights in her hair. Your Honor, she said clearly, I have evidence to present. She placed their homestead ledger on the table, its pages dog-eared from daily use. This documents our shared life and work since November. Next came Agent Rourke's inspection report, the official seal clearly visible. The United States Land Office has verified our legitimate household. The judge examined both documents carefully while the room held its breath. Addison reached into her satchel one final time and withdrew Jaden's Bible, its leather worn smooth with handling. And this, Your Honor, her voice grew softer but no less firm, holds the most important proof of all. She opened it to the flyleaf and read aloud. If Jaden Creed ever claims my daughter, he does so with my blessing. The words hung in the air like a prayer. When was this written? The judge asked. 3 years ago, Your Honor, shortly before my father died. Addison's chin lifted. Reverend Matthews can confirm it is my father's hand. The minister rose from his seat. I can indeed, Your Honor. I witnessed Preacher Wade write those very words on his deathbed. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. And the land agent? Cass Rourke stepped forward, his manner businesslike. I personally inspected the creed. Homestead twice, Your Honor. Found all evidence of a proper household. Shared meals, common prayer, joint labor recorded in detail. The improvements required by law are being met through their combined efforts. Call your next witness, the judge directed Addison. Eli Brandt stood, his rough hands clasped before him. Your Honor, that man and his wife saved my boy Tommy from freezing to death just last week. Nursed him through the night, treated him like their own. That ain't the action of no forced arrangement. And you, Mrs. Creed, the judge turned back to Addison. What do you say to these allegations of coercion? Addison's voice rang with quiet conviction. I am Jaden's wife by vow and by choice, Your Honor. He offered protection when others showed cruelty, and respect when others gave scorn. Our marriage may have begun unusually, but it has grown into something true and right before God. The courtroom remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. Where before it held tension, now it held something closer to reverence. "Mr. Creed?" Judge Harrison's stern gaze fixed on Jaden. "You've been notably quiet. Have you anything to say in your defense?" Jaden stood slowly, his chains clinking softly. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion but unwavering. "Your Honor, I'd have gone to prison before I'd shame her. Everything I'd done was to protect her dignity and her rights to choose. That's the truth before God and this court." The judge studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "This court will recess briefly while I consider the evidence. Sheriff, please clear the room." The next 15 minutes stretched like molasses in winter. Addison sat with her mother, who pressed a handkerchief into her trembling hands. Jaden remained between his guards, head bowed as if in prayer. Orrin Pike paced near the window, his confident manner beginning to crack. When the bailiff called them back inside, Judge Harrison's expression was stern but clear. He waited until all were seated before speaking. "This court finds no evidence of coercion or improper influence in the marriage of Jaden and Addison Creed. Their union, though unconventional in its beginnings, has demonstrated all the hallmarks of a legitimate household under territorial law." His gaze swept the room. "The charges are hereby dismissed." A relieved murmur rose from the gathered townsfolk. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, fixing Orrin Pike with a steely look, "this court formally reprimands Mr. Pike for malicious filing of false charges. The costs of these proceedings will be assessed to him directly. Sheriff," he added, "release Mr. Creed from custody." Addison barely waited for the deputies to unlock the jail yard gate before rushing to Jaden. Their hands clasped through the bars as tears of joy and relief spilled down her cheeks. She laughed and wept at once, their fingers intertwining like they'd never let go. The heavy iron gate creaked open. Jaden stepped through, free at last, and drew Addison close. The watching crowd's whispers had transformed from gossip to something warmer, like prayers of blessing murmured over a newborn child. Together they walked down the courthouse steps into the winter sunlight. The morning's frost had melted, leaving the world washed clean and bright. The mountain peaks stood sentinel in the distance, beckoning them home. Morning light spilled through the post office windows, catching dust motes that danced above the rough wooden counter. Addison smoothed a fresh sheet of paper, her pen hovering thoughtfully above the crisp surface. The scratch of her writing filled the quiet room as she began her careful appeal to the land office in Washington. "To the Honorable Commissioner," she wrote in her neat hand, each letter formed with purpose. The words flowed steadily as she detailed the settlement patterns along Wind River, marking each homestead's location and improvements. Her description painted a vivid picture of the community they'd built. The shared wells, the carefully tended fields, the routes that connected neighbor to neighbor. She paused, considering her next words carefully. "The proposed railroad cut through Timber Ridge would displace 5 established families," she continued. "However, an alternate route following Thunder Creek would preserve these homesteads while offering more gradual grades for the trains." Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Always seek the path that serves both justice and mercy." Postmaster Jenkins watched from behind his sorting table, nodding approval at her methodical approach. When she finished, he cleared his throat. "Best be patient, Mrs. Creed. Mail to Washington moves like molasses in January." Addison folded the letter carefully, pressing each crease with her thumbnail. "How long would you reckon?" 6 weeks there, 6 weeks back, if we're fortunate." He accepted the envelope, weighing it in his weathered hands. Might be longer if spring storms delay the stages. Time enough, Addison said quietly, accepting frontier rhythms with grace earned through seasons of waiting. She paid for the postage with careful counts of pennies, each one representing hours of work. The bank's brass bell chimed as she entered, her boots leaving small puddles of melted snow on the polished floor. Orrin Pike's father barely glanced up from his ledger, but the young clerk straightened his tie and offered a hopeful smile. "I've come about my grandmother Wade's account," Addison stated clearly, placing a folded document on the counter. "I believe you'll find everything in order." The senior Pike examined the papers with obvious surprise, his eyebrows rising at the modest but respectable sum detailed within. Addison had guarded this inheritance carefully, knowing too well how quickly news of a dowry could draw the wrong kind of attention. Jaden, who had accompanied her, shifted uncomfortably. "Addison, you don't need to—" She touched his arm gently. "This isn't about pride or purchasing anything," she explained softly. "It's about stewarding what God's provided to secure our home. The land needs us as much as we need it." His expression softened, understanding dawning in his eyes. They both knew the truth. This wasn't about buying status or silk dresses. This was about protecting their future, their home, their shared dream of a place where they could build something lasting. The banker cleared his throat. "The funds can be transferred immediately for the filing fees and deed process." He couldn't quite hide his revised assessment of the woman he'd previously dismissed. "Thank you," Addison replied simply, signing where indicated. Her signature was firm and clear, Addison Creed, each letter a testament to her chosen path. The afternoon sun had begun its westward slide when they met Cass Rourke at his office. The land agent's desk was buried under maps and documents, but he cleared a space with efficient movements, laying out fresh papers for their affidavits. "Every detail matters," he explained, dipping his pen. "The more thorough we are now, the stronger your claim stands." He began copying their ledger entries, his precise handwriting transforming their daily work into legal record. Addison and Jaden sat close together, shoulders touching as they reviewed each entry. Every cord of wood split, every repair made, every improvement to the land was carefully documented. Their shared life, once a temporary arrangement, had grown into something deep and true, recorded now in ink and official seals. "I'll ride to the district clerk first thing tomorrow," Rourke promised, sanding the final signature. "Weather holding, we should have preliminary approval within the month." The journey home was quiet, both of them lost in thought as their horses picked their way through the gathering dusk. The cabin windows glowed warm welcome as they approached, smoke rising straight from the chimney in the still evening air. Inside, Red greeted them with thumping tail while they shed their cold, stiffened coats. Jaden built up the fire while Addison set water to heat for tea. The familiar routine felt different somehow, more settled, more certain. When the stove was crackling steadily, they knelt together beside it, hands clasped in prayer. The words came easily now, shared gratitude rising with the warmth. "Thank you, Lord," Addison whispered, "for bringing us to this place, for showing us your path." "Amen," Jaden added softly, his rough hand gentle around hers. They sat in comfortable silence after, watching the flames dance behind the stove's iron grate. Outside, the wind that had so often howled like a lonely wolf now murmured more gently, like a friend sharing secrets. "Come spring," Jaden said thoughtfully, "we could run fence lines along the west slope where the grass grows thick." Addison nodded, already envisioning it. "And the south wall of the cabin gets good sun. Beans could climb there with proper supports." "Peas, too," he added, a smile touching his eyes. "Your mother mentioned you've got away with peas." They continued planning as the evening deepened, mapping their future in quiet words and shared dreams. What had begun as necessity, a marriage of convenience to protect land and dignity, had transformed into something neither had expected. Their bond, tested by town gossip and legal challenges, had emerged stronger, truer, rooted now in choice and devotion rather than mere duty. The ledger sat on the table, its pages filled with their shared story. Beside it, Jaden's Bible lay open to the Psalms, her father's blessing still clear on the flyleaf. Both books testified to promises made and kept, to faith proven through action, to love grown in the good soil of shared purpose. They had come to the end of one chapter, but their story, their real story, was just beginning. Together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, their covenant sealed not just on paper now, but in their hearts. Spring crept into the mountains like a shy child, testing each step before committing. Icicles that had hung thick as wagon tongues from the cabin eaves began their slow surrender, dripping in steady rhythm against the packed snow below. The creek, so long muffled under its winter blanket, found its voice again, mumbling ancient songs as it woke. Addison stood in the doorway one morning, watching winter's retreat. The air carried new scents, wet earth, pine sap, and the promise of green things stirring. Behind her, Jaden pulled on his boots, planning the day's work. "Ground's nearly soft enough for planting," he observed, joining her at the threshold. "Another week of this thaw should do it." She nodded, already seeing in her mind's eye where each crop would go. They'd spent winter evenings sketching plans on scraps of paper, mapping out their small empire of sustenance. Potatoes here, beans there, sturdy cabbages to store for winter. The mud was treacherous, grabbing at their boots with hungry persistence as they worked. Over the next fortnight, they fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Addison worked the softening soil with a hoe, while Jaden turned deeper earth with the spade. They planted in hope and faith. Potatoes nestled into their earthen beds, bean seeds pressed into careful rows, cabbage starts protected by makeshift windbreaks. "My mother swears by planting potatoes on a waning moon," Addison said one afternoon, patting soil over another seed piece. Jaden smiled, rare and warm. "My brother Samuel used to say the same." His voice held old grief but newer peace when speaking of his lost brother now. The gate had taken damage during winter storms, listing drunkenly on its leather hinges. They tackled it together, Addison holding boards steady while Jaden drove fresh pegs. The leather they soaked and worked until it was supple again, then wrapped it carefully around the posts. "Might last another season," Jaden mused, testing the swing. "Longer, if we keep at it," Addison replied, her quiet confidence drawing another smile from him. The new clothes line stretched like a promise between two sturdy posts, ready to hold their future clean linens and mended shirts. Addison ran her hand along the rope, testing its strength. Already she could picture sheets snapping in the mountain wind, white as clouds against the blue sky. Their peaceful industry was interrupted one morning by the arrival of the survey crew, their transit gleaming in the spring sun. Addison's heart tightened, but before worry could take root, Agent Rourke appeared on his sorrel gelding, waving papers like a flag of truce. "Good news," he called, dismounting with his usual efficiency. "Word from Washington. They've acknowledged your filings." He pulled out the official documents, pointing to the crucial passages. "Between your established improvements and the terrain complications south of Thunder Creek, the railroads decided to shift their line." Jaden's shoulders, which had been carrying winter's worth of tension, finally relaxed. "South?" he asked, seeking confirmation. Following the creek route you suggested, Mrs. Creed. Rourke nodded to Addison. Easier grade for the trains, and it leaves the homesteads intact. The victory felt too precious to celebrate alone. That Sunday, Addison invited several widows from church to share their noon meal. The cabin, once Jaden's solitary refuge, filled with the warm bustle of feminine company. Lamplight caught the steam rising from her thick stew, and laughter seasoned the air as surely as the herbs in the pot. Mrs. Turner brought fresh-baked bread, still warm from her oven. "Bless you for thinking of us," she said, squeezing Addison's hand. "It's been a long winter for lonely hearts." The Brants arrived with Tommy, now sturdy and pink-cheeked, nothing like the half-frozen child they'd rescued months ago. He stuck close to Jaden, watching with serious eyes as the mountain man worked at the hearth with his carving tools. "What are you making, Mr. Creed?" Tommy asked, tracing the letters taking shape in the wood. "Adding something important," Jaden replied softly. "See here? This says Brother Samuel. He was here first. Now we're adding Addison because she's home too." Addison, laying out bowls nearby, felt tears prick at her eyes. She knew what it cost him to share Samuel's space, to acknowledge how love could grow even in grief's shadow. The afternoon passed in gentle waves of conversation and companionship. Stories flowed like the creek outside. Tales of winters survived, gardens coaxed from reluctant soil, children grown and flown. When twilight began gathering around the eaves, their guests departed with wrapped portions of leftover stew, each bundle tied carefully in clean cloth. Tommy hugged them both before leaving. "Can I come back when you plant more things?" he asked, hopefully. "Count on it," Jaden answered, ruffling the boy's hair. Quiet settled over the cabin like a comfortable quilt. Outside, the first brave crickets of spring tested their legs against the cooling air. Addison and Jaden sat together on the porch steps, watching darkness seep up from the valley below. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. All the uncertainty of their beginning, the auction, the pretense, the waiting, had transformed into something as real as the ground beneath their feet. "Home," she said simply, putting a lifetime of meaning into that single word. His arm tightened around her gently. "By grace," he answered, his voice rough with gratitude. Above them, the first star pierced the deepening blue, bright as hope, and just as eternal. The cricket song strengthened, nature's own choir welcoming the night. Together they watched darkness soften the mountain's edges, each lost in quiet thanks for promises kept, and new ones just beginning. Late spring painted the mountain meadow in sweeps of wild color. Indian paintbrush stood like tiny flames among the grass, their red-orange petals catching sunlight. Purple lupine nodded in graceful spires, while delicate yellow bells danced on hair-thin stems with each passing breeze. The air held the sweet perfume of warming earth and new growth. Addison sat with her back against a weathered fence post, her mother's worn Bible open in her lap. The familiar words of Proverbs flowed like clear water as she read aloud, her voice carrying just far enough to reach Jaden where he worked on the fence line. She paused between verses to watch him, his strong hands steady as he twisted wire around the final post. "That should hold through winter," he said, testing the wire's tension with a careful pull. Sweat darkened his shirt between his shoulders, testament to the morning's labor. "Might even keep those wandering Brant cattle where they belong this time." Addison marked her place with a pressed lupine bloom. "Tommy says they're getting a new bull come fall. His uncle claims it'll improve the whole herd." "Speaking of Tommy," Jaden said, wiping his hands on his kerchief, "have you given more thought to that schooling idea?" She nodded, gathering her skirts as she stood. The breeze caught at her hair, loosening strands from their pins. "I talked with Reverend Wells last Sunday. He thinks we could use the church 3 days a week once harvest is in. There are at least 6 children within riding distance who need learning." "And you're sure you want to take that on, along with everything else?" Jaden's tone held no doubt, only gentle concern for her taking on too much. "I'm sure." Addison smiled, touching the Bible's worn cover. "Daddy always said education was next to godliness. Besides, Tommy's sharp as a tack. It would be a shame to waste that mind on just cattle work." They walked together along the fence line, discussing the future as easily as they might plan. Supper. The winter stores would need careful tending. Already the root cellar held rows of preserved vegetables from their first successful garden. Addison had plans for drying more herbs, and Jaden spoke of smoking extra meat when the weather turned cold. "The widow Thorne asked if we might spare her boy some work come harvest," Addison mentioned, stepping carefully around a patch of paintbrush. "She's struggling since John passed." Jaden nodded thoughtfully. "Could use the help with that south field. Might teach him some carpentry, too, if he's willing to learn." They'd made a practice of opening their home to those in need, following the example that had brought them together. The lonely and the poor found welcome at their table, and more than one traveler had sheltered in their barn during storms. It felt right, using their blessing to bless others. "Heard news in town yesterday," Jaden said after a quiet moment. "Orrin Pike's gone east. His father sent him to relatives in Boston after the judge's censure." Addison remembered the courthouse, the judge's stern words about malicious accusations and the abuse of position. The warning had rippled through the town like stones dropped in still water, reminding men that power didn't excuse cruelty. "I've been praying for him," she admitted, "that he might find peace somewhere far from here." Jaden's hand found hers, rough palm against smooth. "You've got a bigger heart than most, wife." The sun was settling toward the western peaks when they turned back toward the cabin. Smoke rose straight and thin from the chimney where the widow Carson tended the fire. She and her young son had taken shelter with them 2 weeks past, after spring floods damaged their own small house. Inside, the cabin glowed with evening warmth. Addison moved to the cooling bread loaves while Jaden lit the lamp, its gentle light pushing back the gathering shadows. Young Michael Carson, all of 6 years old, helped set out plates while his mother stirred the stew pot. "Smells like heaven itself," the widow said, offering Addison a tired smile. "Don't know what we'd have done without you both." "The Lord provides," Addison answered simply, cutting thick slices of fresh bread. They gathered around the table, heads bowed for grace. The prayer, led by Jaden's deep voice, thanked God for daily bread and the gift of sharing it. Steam rose from their bowls like incense as they ate, conversation flowing easy and warm between them. After the meal came pie, Addison's specialty, fresh strawberry and rhubarb from their spring garden. Michael's eyes grew wide at the treat, and even his careworn mother managed a second slice. When the dishes were cleared and dried, Jaden read a chapter from the Bible while the others listened, lamplight pooling around them like honey. "Time for sleep, young man," Widow Carson said when the reading finished. Michael protested sleepily, but allowed himself to be led to the curtained corner where they slept. Soon his soft breathing joined the night's quiet music. Addison stepped out onto the porch, drawing in the cool mountain air. Behind her, the lamp cast warm light through the window, making the glass glow like amber. Jaden followed, his footsteps familiar on the wooden boards. The moon rode high and full, turning the meadow to silver and shadow. Its light caught the scars on Jaden's face, marking the stories written there by time and trial. He drew Addison close, his arms strong and gentle around her waist. She closed the Bible she'd carried out, holding it against her heart. The leather was smooth with years of handling, its pages holding generations of faith. Jaden's chest rumbled with quiet laughter. "A virtuous woman is far above rubies," he quoted, his breath warm against her hair. "And heavier than gold, thank the Lord." Addison swatted his arm, unable to hold back her own laughter. "Jaden Creed, you impossible man." Their shared mirth rose soft and clear into the night air, a sound of pure joy. The mountains seemed to cup that happiness in their ancient hands, holding it like a precious thing. Behind them, the lamp burned steady and bright in the window, a beacon of welcome in the gathering dark. The breeze carried the scent of lupine and new grass, whispering around them like a blessing. Addison leaned into her husband's embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart. All the shame that had once weighted her steps had been transformed, molecule by molecule, into something shining and strong. Here was honor, built from love's patient labor. Here was grace, made visible in opened doors and shared bread. The mountain night deepened around them, star-scattered and vast. In the spare corner, Michael Carson dreamed child-sweet dreams, while his mother rested easy for the first time in months. The cabin held them all in its warm embrace, a shelter made holy by simple acts of mercy. Jaden pressed a kiss to Addison's temple, gentle as a prayer. Together they stood in the moonlight, surrounded by the wild beauty they'd fought to protect. Their love had grown like the spring flowers, modest, persistent, and ultimately impossible to ignore. It bloomed now in the quiet moments, in shared work and daily bread, in laughter and in silence. The lamp burned steady behind them, its light reaching out into the darkness like hope made visible. Around them, the mountains kept their ancient watch, witnesses to love's slow, certain victory over fear and loneliness. In their shadow, two hearts beat in perfect time, keeping the rhythm of a song that had only just begun. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.